Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon so that you never miss any video lesson from Rouse IAS Study Circle. Now we are also available on Telegram, so join our Telegram channel by clicking on the link that is available in the description below to get the latest updates from Rouse IAS Study Circle. Hello and welcome to the Daily News Simplified, an analysis of the Hindu newspaper from UPSC perspective. Today we will discuss the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 4th May 2021, and the articles that we will discuss today are displayed on your screen. But before starting the discussion, we have a very important announcement for you. And we note that most of the students are confused about which optional subject to choose, how to find the best teachers, and academic support for the optional paper, and above all, how to prepare for the same during these difficult times. For this, Rouse IAS has the best solution for your optional subject related problems. In this line, we are conducting optional orientation sessions on 22nd and 29th May 2021, in which you can learn from Rouse IAS teachers about how to prepare for the optional subjects and how are we going to help you in scoring best in the mains examination. The optional batches are starting from 4th June and 5th July 2021 via live online classes. Now consider this as a call to all those who wish to completely cover the optional subject by December 2021. This will ensure timely coverage of optional subject, and then you can focus your attention completely on the prelims from January or February 2022 and keep revising the optional subject till you appear for the mains examination. Rouse IAS is offering guidance for political science, public administration, history, sociology, geography, economics and psychology from Delhi, Jaipur and Bangalore centers. In the description of this video, there is a link which you can use to register yourself for the orientation for the respective optional subject session. We at Rouse IAS are committed to give you the best guidance and academic support to excel in the civil services examination. Join the orientation and click start your mains optional subject preparation from a team of best teachers in the civil services test preparation. Now this article on page number 14 talks about the decreasing share of OPEC countries in India's oil imports. So basically it talks about the diversification that is taking place in India's oil imports. Initially, India was heavily dependent on the OPEC countries. However, now it is diversifying its imports for the crude oil towards United States of America as well as Canada. In this regard, it has been said that at one point in time, India's oil imports from the OPEC countries amounted to about 80%. However, this import from the OPEC countries has seen a considerable drop, and now it has come to around 72% of India's oil requirements from the OPEC countries. So initially it was 80%, from there on it has dropped to about 72%. And because of the diversification, India's imports from the United States of America and Canada has increased considerably. So what is important for us from the preliminary examination perspective is to know what is meant by the OPEC countries, or what is this OPEC group all about and who all are the members of OPEC group. However, it is also important to learn about one of the deals that was going on between OPEC and the non-OPEC oil producing countries, and that was known as the OPEC Plus. Now, what OPEC Plus aimed at is that it tried to reduce the supply of the crude oil in order to increase its prices. And the prices of the crude oil fell down rapidly last year because of the health crisis in different countries across the globe. And accordingly, the demand for the oil also reduced. And that is why, because of this reduced demand, there was fall in the prices of crude oil. And accordingly, in order to boost the prices of the crude oil, the OPEC plus countries tried to cut down the production of oil. However, that did not materialize because of Russian withdrawal, and that is why the OPEC plus deal could not be finalized. However, let us learn about this OPEC grouping and who all are the members of this OPEC group. Also, let us learn who all were the member of the OPEC plus deal, which can be important for us from the preliminary examination perspective. Now, as far as the OPEC grouping is concerned, it is a permanent intergovernmental organization of 14 oil exporting developing nations that coordinates and unifies the petroleum policies of its member countries. So it is basically a group of countries that are oil producing countries that aim at influencing the petrol prices and the petroleum related policies of its member countries. Now, it was created at Baghdad Conference in 1960 by the founding members Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. However, currently there are 14 members. Now, OPEC's objective is to coordinate and unify the petroleum policies among the member countries, and in order to secure fair and stable prices for the petroleum producer. That is, its main aim is to make the prices of crude oil stable and fair. Also, they aim at making an efficient and economic and regular supply of petroleum to the consuming nations. And the headquarters of the OPEC countries is located in the capital of Austria, that is Vienna. Now, as far as the OPEC plus grouping that is sometimes seen in the news is concerned, it is a group of OPEC countries and its allies. It also includes non OPEC oil producing countries, and these include Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Brunei, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Mexico, Oman, Russia, Sudan, and South Sudan. So, these are some of the countries which are members of the non OPEC plus oil countries. Now, it is important to note that we have here seen the members of the OPEC grouping, which are all oil producing countries, and besides that, we have also seen the OPEC plus countries, which are also oil producing countries, but they are non OPEC oil producing countries. However, besides these countries that we have discussed here, there are many countries which are also oil producing. And one of the key players in the international market, which is not a part of OPEC as well as not a part of OPEC plus, is United States of America. And of late, Canada is also emerging as one of the important oil producing nations. So you also need to be aware that it is not just the OPEC and the OPEC plus countries which are oil producing, but there are more number of countries that also produce crude oil. With this, let's take up the next news article now. Now, this article on page number 14 talks about the factory output growth that is decelerating, and this has been highlighted by the Purchasing Managers Index or the PMI index. So basically, from our prelims examination perspective, it is important for us to know the basics of PMI, who publishes it, how it is compiled, etc. And also, it should be compared with another measure of industrial growth in India, that is Index of Industrial Production, that is IIP. So we will do a comparative analysis of PMI with that of the IIP. Now, the prelims compass of Indian economy of 2019 provided various aspects of the Purchasing Managers Index. And regarding this, you should note that it is considered as an indicator of the economic health and business momentum in the industrial sector in an economy, and also it reflects the investors' sentiments regarding the manufacturing sector of economy. Now, it should be noted that this PMI or the Purchasing Managers Index is published separately for manufacturing and for the service sector. However, it is the Purchasing Managers Index or the PMI for the manufacturing sector which is extremely important reflection of the functioning of an economy. Now, if the PMI data reads above 50 points, it indicates that there is an economic expansion in manufacturing or either the service sector. While if the reading of this PMI is less than 50, it shows that there is contraction in the economic activities. For example, India's PMI has gone down to as low as 47.9. And in the present case, this PMI was 51.2 in the month of November as provided in today's news article. So regarding this, you should note that what was the origin of the PMI or the Purchasing Managers Index. So the Institute of Supply and Management ISM, which is based in US, originally developed this concept of PMI. And this ISM was a non-profit group founded in 1915. So regarding the PMI which is published in India, you should note that the PMI data is published by the Japanese firm Nikkei. However, it is compiled and constructed by the market economics of the HSBC. And which are the indicators which are used by the PMI? So it uses 5 major indicators, and these include new orders, inventory level production, supplier deliveries, and the employment environment. Now, the important thing that should be noted about the PMI is that it does not track the volume of production in the manufacturing sector, and it only tracks the sentiment of the manufacturing sector through the survey of almost 500 private companies. So this naturally means that it does not track the manufacturing sentiment in the public sector enterprises. And these particular observations can be important for our preliminary examination as to if the PMI tracks the PSUs or not. So after understanding the basic points regarding the PMI, let us look at the comparison of this PMI with the Index of Industrial Production. So by comparing the PMI and the IIP, we find that this PMI tracks only the investor's sentiment. and it does not track the actual production. However, IIP tracks the actual production. Secondly, there is a difference in the publishing agencies of both these indices, and the first PMI is published by Nikki. However, the Index of Industrial Production is published by NSO or the National Statistical Office. Third point of comparison is that it covers only private sector companies. However, the IIP covers both the private sector as well as the public sector. Fourthly, the PMI covers both the manufacturing as well as the services sector. And in case of IIP, it is only concerned with the manufacturing sectors, and that is why it covers only the manufacturing in India. Fifth is that the PMI is not used for GDP calculation, and that is mainly because it only tracks the investor's sentiment. However, as the IIP covers or tracks the actual production, it is used for GDP calculation to account for unorganized sector also. So these are few points of differences between the PMI, that is the Purchasing Managers Index, and the Index of Industrial Production. And these can be important for us from preliminary examination point of view. With this, let's take up the next article.
This article is from page number 8. 7 Myanmar refugees can approach United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee in New Delhi. See, the news is that the High Court of Manipur has allowed the 7 Myanmar nationals who have entered India recently secretly in the backdrop of the military coup that has happened in Myanmar to travel to New Delhi to seek protection from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. These 7 nationals of Myanmar were previously hiding in Moreh. Moreh is a town at the border of India and Myanmar in the state of Manipur. Moreh is also the place from where the India-Myanmar-Thailand highway will be originating. So you can add Moreh to your list of places in news if you are not already knowing where Moreh is. Now let's look at the observation that the High Court of Manipur has given. First of all, the court has said that these Myanmarese individuals, they are not migrants as normally understood. The court has used this language as normally understood because the word migrant or refugee has not been defined in Indian laws. The court has taken the view that these Myanmarese individuals, they are asylum seekers. Why? Because the country is under the boil, and these individuals, they are linked with banned media houses. The court further said that they did not enter into our country with any clear-cut and deliberate intention of breaking and violating our domestic laws, meaning they are not national security or public order threat. The bench also has observed that although India is not party to United Nations Refugee Convention of 1951 or its protocol of 1967, but India is party to Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966. The point that the bench was making with this argument is that the principle of non-refoulement that began with United Nations Refugee Convention of 1951 will apply to India even if India is not party to this convention, because India is party to other international conventions that deals with the principle of non-refoulement. About principle of non-refoulement, we'll talk in just a bit. The court also made the argument, which you must be aware of, that Indian Constitution under Article 14, Article 21 provides protection to foreigners as well. Under Article 21, foreigners are also entitled to right to protection of life and personal liberty. The court then explicitly said that when Article 21 of our Constitution is read along with various judgments of Supreme Court and other high courts, it is enormously clear that Article 21 of our Constitution encompasses the right of non-refoulement. You know that India does not have a clear refugee protection policy or framework, but despite this, India hosts large number of refugees and give asylum to large number of seekers from nearby countries. And India usually respect the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees recognition of a status of asylum seekers coming mainly from Afghanistan and Myanmar. And for these reasons, the court has allowed the refugees to go to New Delhi. Why New Delhi? because in the office of New Delhi of United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, refugee status determination is done. And it is only in New Delhi's office of UNHCR that refugee status determination is done. That is why the court has allowed them to go to New Delhi. Now, let us talk a little bit more on the principle of non refoulement. The principle of non refoulement has been inscribed in many international laws, including the Refugee Convention of United Nations of 1951. As per this principle, a person fleeing from persecution from his own country should not be forced to return back to the homeland where he or she faces threat. As we have seen previously, that the court has observed that India is not a member of United Nations Refugee Convention of 1951 or even not a signatory of its protocol of 1967. But India is party to Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966. Apart from these, India is also signatory to the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants that was signed in 2016. India is also signatory to UN Anti-Torture Convention. But remember, India has never ratified this. India is only signatory. And India is only one of the 5 countries that have not ratified it yet. Apart from being signatory to these 2 conventions, India is also signatory to the Bangkok Principles that deals with refugees. And inherent in these 3 conventions is the principle of non-refoulement. In fact, the courts in India have through various judgments made it part of Article 21. In the Khater Abbas Habib versus Union of India and others, non-refoulement was recognized under Article 21 by Gujarat High Court. Later in NHRC versus State of Arunachal Pradesh, Supreme Court emphasized on protection of rights of refugees in India to preserve the constitutional culture. In this case, Supreme Court directed not to refoul the Chakma refugees who came from Bangladesh, recognizing the principle of non-refoulement. And then various courts used this principle of non-refoulement to protect the rights of refugees in India. For instance, in the case Syed Ata Muhammadi versus Union of India, Bombay High Court asked the Iranian refugees to not be refouled back to Iran where they fear persecution. These are some of the cases that you can keep in mind, one of one High Court from Bombay or Gujarat and one of Supreme Court for the mains examination. But I must also tell you that the principle of non-refoulement is not absolute. In fact, even in the United Nations Convention on Refugees of 1951, there are 2 grounds for limiting the application of this principle. One is national security, the other is public order. The courts in India has been mindful of these 2 criterias. If the situational case does not seem to undermine India's national security or public order, the courts in India have allowed the principle of non-refoulement to be applicable. For instance, in the case of Afghan human freedom petitioners versus the state of Punjab and others, Supreme Court stayed the expulsion of Burmese refugees because there was no reasonable apprehension against the security of India. That is why the first observation of the High Court of Manipur that we saw, the bench said that the refugees in question did not enter our country with clear-cut and deliberate intention of breaking and violating our domestic laws. In the opinion of the court, they did not undermine national security or public order, and that is why the court has allowed the principle of non-refoulement to be applicable. Now I'm going to tell you one important thing that you must know. In India, there is a rare dual system concerning refugee status determination. Refugee status determination is a legal or administrative process by which generally governments and in some cases UNHCR determine whether a person seeking international protection is to be considered a refugee under international, regional, or national laws. Meaning you apply for asylum, you apply for refugee status, and decision is taken in India both by government and UNHCR. In case of non-neighboring countries plus Myanmar, the decision is taken by whom? It's taken by UNHCR. United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees conducts refugee status determination in India for whom? For non-neighboring countries including Myanmar. The determination of refugee status is done by UNHCR in line with United Nations Refugee Convention of 1951 and some internal guidelines which is recognized by Ministry of Home Affairs. You must also know that UNHCR is not permitted in India to open registration centers at border. The one and only office of UNHCR that conducts refugee status determination is in New Delhi. So the onus is on the asylum seekers to find out about the procedure of seeking asylum and travel down to New Delhi. But in the neighboring countries of South Asia, where the states have sensitive relations, the people from these states, if they want to seek asylum status, refugee status, they have to approach Ministry of Home Affairs directly. UNHCR deals with the cases coming from non-neighboring countries, but that includes Myanmar as well. And that is why the High Court of Manipur has allowed these 7 Myanmar nationals to travel to New Delhi. There's a lead article on page number 6 on One Health approach. We have covered One Health approach previously in the DNS. I'll just append that video here in case you have missed on this concept. The advent of antibiotics created a hope that all infectious diseases from animals and humans will be eliminated. But the hope didn't come true. This article gives out the reason as to why it is difficult to counter antimicrobial resistance through novel antibiotics. And in response, the article suggests that we must adopt a policy of One Health. There are 2 reasons as to why antibiotics have not eliminated infectious diseases from humans and animals. One is the ability of microorganisms to mutate, meaning changes in their genetic coding. Antibiotics work on a particular gene coding on particular microorganisms. With the change in the code, microorganisms are not recognized and the antibiotics does not work. And this gives rise to antimicrobial resistance. The other is the irrational use of antibiotics in humans and animals. When we do not complete the dose of antibiotics, then the microorganisms become resistant to the antibiotic. Next time we fall ill, it does not work. Not only that, we have created microbes which are resistant to antibiotics and that microbes will go into the environment and infect others. So it is not a civil wrong, it's a criminal wrong. The issue is very serious because the inability of antibiotics to treat patients is wreaking havoc on human health, nutritional safety, and on overall economy. The long-term impact of antimicrobial resistance is comparable to that of COVID-19 pandemic. Antimicrobial resistance is estimated to cause 10 million deaths annually by 2050. It is estimated to cause reduction of 7.5% of production of livestock. And it is estimated that the global GDP will be impacted by 3.5% because of antimicrobial resistance. So the issue is very serious and we have to look for solution. One of the solution is to have new drugs present in advance so that when the microbes mutate, we have the antibiotics already present. And the other is the prudent use of available antibiotics so that the efficacy of antibiotics remain for a long time. These are the 2 solutions, but practically the number of solutions will decrease by 1 because only one of them are implementable. The idea of having antibiotic present already in advance sounds brilliant. The only problem is that it is not implementable. The mutation that will happen in the germ is very difficult to predict. The whole process of developing antibiotics for the known genetic code is super expensive, and guessing the mutated form of genetic code and developing antibiotics for that will be super expensive. This you can realize by the fact that since 1984, no new class of antibiotics has been developed. The estimated cost of developing a new antibiotic exceeds $1 billion. And with rapid development of resistance, the life of any new antibiotics is very limited. And this discourages the pharmaceutical industry. So the only viable, practical, implementable solution
is the prudent use of available antibiotics so that the efficacy of the antibiotic is maintained. And the prudent use will come if we have a coordinated approach. We deal with the problems in an integrated manner, and that the author is calling as One Health approach. One Health approach basically means all the problems that we have, from antimicrobial resistance to pandemics to the health issues, all of that should be looked collectively under one prism. For example, the problem of pandemic is not divorced from the problem of antimicrobial resistance. Given the fact that almost all epidemic of the current millennium, for example SARS, MERS or blood flu of COVID-19, they have originated from animals. So it is important to look at pandemics coupled with human-animal environment interface. And this problem should be looked together with the practices in hospitals, the behavior of patients while consuming antimicrobial drugs. That should be clubbed with disposal of antimicrobial drugs in environment. If applied properly, One Health can become an efficient and cost-effective response to antimicrobial resistance problem. And COVID-19 pandemic has emphasized on urgency of implementing One Health because you see the prolonged time that it's taking to come up with a new drug. India's National Action Plan on Antimicrobial Resistance is a model for One Health. But the thing is that we need to implement that.
Now we have come to the end of today's DNS session. Answer to yesterday's question of the day is there on your screen, as well as today's question of the day. Please attempt the question, write your answer in the comment section, and also attempt the DNS quiz on our eLearn platform. Thank you so much for being here. Goodbye, take care, and protect yourself from COVID-19.